Good evening and welcome to our first Shop Night Live. We're going to talk about wood tonight. So many things are affected by just understanding the characteristics and nature of wood. So I'm just going to do a very light dive, I guess you'd say, but try to be as practical as possible. So it all begins with a tree. What I have here is a piece of white American ash that I cut down today, and it's really pretty sad what's going on with the ash trees. This little whitish here is from birds probably pecking at it, because this one's infested with the emerald ash borer. So we've got quite a few ash trees on our property, and unfortunately most of them look like they're already infested. So the good news is they don't get into the lumber, so if they're large enough trees to make into boards, you can still use them, but most of it's going to end up being firewood, unfortunately. So I cut this piece. I tried to cut it so it was manageable, but I could have made it a little shorter. All right, that's good. But I wanted to talk about just the nature of wood. Like, we see the tree standing there, and it's got a root system and the trunk going up to this big ball of leaves, and the crown of the tree is of various shape. If it's in the woods, like we have so many trees around here, they grow tall and straight as if the leaves just branch out near the top, looking for light and nutrients that way. But if it's out in an open field, they just really bloom into these large trees, but they don't tend to have as long of a trunk. So the ones actually in the woods, more thickly settled, are better for lumber, for woodworking and construction, whatever, because you have a much longer straight section before they start to go off in other directions. But I've got this pretty straight section from the bottom of this ash tree, and here's the bottom of it. It's still wet, but you can see, I'm trying to see, you can see all the growth rings here. This dark area in the middle is the heart. That's where it's, some woods have heartwood that's much darker, and ash is one of them. So you have this wide, this is the really white, creamy colored, and then this is the dark. A lot of people try to avoid this when they're using ash, but it's nice because it's such a strong contrast. But we've got the typical set of the growth rings around, and each growth ring is a year. If trees are in thickly settled, like where the woods are thick, the growth rings tend to be much closer together because the tree just isn't getting all that full sun, and it's not in the best environment to grow. So sometimes you'll see trees like this board was cut from. This is a piece of southern yellow pine. Like, this line to this line is 1 inch. And look at that. We've got basically 1, 2, 3 growth rings. So this tree grew 1 inch in the radius, actually grew 2 inches in diameter, but 3 years over 1 inch. Now look at this piece. Stay right there. I'll bring it up. This is from an old beam in a house that was taken down years ago. So this is old growth stock. And I mean, look, it's hand hewn. It must be 200-300 years old. And it's got these lines here. That's 1 inch. And I counted the growth rings here. And this is a piece of hemlock, I believe. But we have 38 growth rings between there. So 38 years for this to grow 1 inch. 3 years for this. So when trees grow like that quickly, they tend to be really weak or of less of less density, just of less quality. I'm always looking for the most dense material I can in material. If you look at the end grain and you see grain like that, it's a fast growing, it's probably a little spongy, just usually they're not as stable and don't have as much character and richness. They're not bad for construction because you're building on the end, but for furniture making, I would stay away from it. But one of the key things to know about wood is it's made up of these long fibers that go along the line of the tree. So you have, in hardwoods, you have these tubes or these vessels that are like straws that go the length of the tree. So I've got a cluster of drinking straws here. This is basically what's happening in hardwood trees. So you have these cell-like structures, these long fibers, and at the coming out this end grain, when you zoom in, you see porous structure, and the differences in the rings are actually where the growth rings are larger, or where there are usually holes. That's the early growth, like when the tree is growing really fast. So let me show you that piece of, I'll just bring it up here. This is that piece of yellow pine again. With yellow pine, it's the softer growth is here. So pine and like any kinds of pine, white pine, yellow pine, those are conifers. They're actually softwood. Conifer just meaning that they spread the seeds for the new trees out of cones. They grow cones and those have the seeds in them. Where deciduous trees that have leaves and have those little helicopter seeds or whatever, they don't have cones. They have leaves that fall every year. Those are the hardwood trees. The conifers are usually evergreen, and they don't have the same cell structure. So that's why I'm not really talking about them. But they do have the difference in growth. So they have like the spongy early, and then it gets hard as they get to the end of the year, and that winter hardness, that type of growth. So we have that softness in that early growth, that speed. And I'm going to show you some images later of the cell structure of some different woods where you have that early growth and you see the actual tube structure of the wood. But I'll save that for the last thing. So that's basically the nature of wood. So it's very strong along the length, but not across. So let me show you these things. Here I've got two pieces of wood. These are identical material, the same thickness, same length and width. It's pine. So it's just white pine. And on one of them, I've oriented the grain as it typically is. The grain is going long. So all those kind of, it's not really tubes in softwoods. It's like a mush. It's like a trachid. They call it tracheids, but it's sort of pulpish. In fact, that's why they make paper out of softwoods, not hardwoods, because it doesn't have any of those tubes. But they boil it down, they get that mush, and then flatten it. Well, it still is transferring water through that whole tube network. That's what it's all about, is moving water up and down the tree, the nutrients from the leaves out to the limbs and into the bark under the growth layer, and then up from the root system in the early spring again. And we're about to have sugaring season. As soon as it gets warm enough, the sap's going to be rushing up all these tube structures on the outer area of the tree, and they'll be tapping and draining off some of it and for the syrup. But with the pine like this, there aren't those tubes, but it has the same kind of strength. So I've got all those, the grain fibers are running the length here. Then this piece, I ran the fibers the other way. Because you see, with straws, it's strong this way, but you can easily kind of split them. They don't hold together strongly, and they break this way. So if I made this board, I'm basically showing you with this, all of the straws are oriented this way. So they're short, and they can come apart easily. So if I take this, I could actually break it. Watch my, this is like the old kung fu trick. They always do it with the grain running this way, right? So if I did this, tried to kung fu trick on this, I would not have success, you know. But if I do this one, see, really tough, huh? Actually, it's only 2.5 inches wide, but that looks impressive, but it barely hit my head. I mean, it's not that hard to break. Let me see, I can't, I'd have to put it in the vise, do it again. But it just breaks easily. But I can't, you put wood in like this with the fibers running a long way, and that is a strong board. There's no way, you know, if they ever oriented it that way, it would be an embarrassing day for the karate master. But anyway, that's the nature of wood. Those long fibers are super strong. All these trees start out round like this, but then they're cut into boards. Now, when the tree is cut down, it's about 35% water. It's just loaded with water. So it's so heavy, and because the fibers are like sponges, it swells up to a larger size. So let me show you this thing here. This represents the center of the tree. That's the pith. That's the first year. Each year is represented by a ring. So the tree is basically all water, and then you cut it into boards. So let's say we cut a boards, like, let's say we cut a board out of here like this. We cut a nice kind of wide one there. And then we cut one over here. Okay. And then let's say we cut one over here. So every board you get, you look at the end grain and you're going to read the growth rings in some orientation like this. So when the tree is first sawn down, it's really wet. So they've got to dry the wood out. So it starts out like 35%. But they'll let it, put it up on sticks, and then most of the wood you buy at a hardwood dealer is kiln dried down to 6 to 8% moisture content. So that's actually the equilibrium moisture content. They say EMC. So 6 to 8% moisture content usually. But if you leave it outside and the relative humidity is 65, 70, relative humidity is different measurement than moisture content in wood. But if the relative humidity is 65 to 70, as it is around here in New Hampshire, the wood will absorb moisture back again if it was down to 6 to 8, and it'll get up to 12 or so. That's why when you move wood from outside that was just air dried, you have to let it acclimate in a dry space. In winter, it's great because it'll do it naturally inside. Sometimes I'll put things in the hot attic and let them final cure if I'm air drying myself. But when it starts out, it's really wet. So when these are sawn into boards, they're going to be rough sawn larger than an inch. So the 4/4 stalk is usually 1 1/8 to 1 1/4 thickness. And then it'll shrink down to usually about 1 1/8. But what happens is the wood it's kind of like a sponge, so it swells up with the water, and it's going to shrink. So the key thing to remember when you're thinking about wood movement is it moves the most right along the growth rings. So it's moving the most right along these lines. So when this expands and contracts, it moves the most along the lines. So this board right here would move the most of these three. So that's going to contract quite a bit because all the lines are running flat to it. Or it's called flat sawn. Here's a piece of cherry that, I don't know if you can see the grain, but you can see it on the front. This is, you can see kind of the wide growth rings here. That's like the cathedral figure. So anyway, that one's going to move a lot. This one is perpendicular to the center, where all the grain is going to be out on the surface perpendicular to it. So the grain is going to move the most this way. So all of these are just moving a little, shrinking and expanding over that. But it only moves half as much. A tree only moves like half as much radially. So it's moving 1/2 as much radially as it does tangentially. So this is more the tangent here to the growth rings. So it's along the line of the growth rings. That moves twice as much as a quarter sawn piece. This is called the quarter sawn piece because the way, it's a sawmill term, how they saw the logs into 4 quarters first, and then they basically quarter it like this, and then they make all their board cuts like that. It's more expensive, so they get more of the quarter sawn figure by cutting it that way. But this is a piece of quarter sawn wood right here. So you can see this is ash, and you can see all the lines are going right like that. So nice linear comb type wood, and it's much more stable that way. So as this board dries, it's going to pull along those growth rings, and this, as it dries, it's going to cup. It's going to become, let me do this better. I'm exaggerating this, but it's going to go like that. Because those lines are drawing up, and it's going to do that, okay? This one, this is going to stay pretty much square, but it's just going to shrink a little bit all over. And then this one, so this is quarter sawn, plain sawn, and when it's at an angle of 30 to 60 degrees, they call it rift sawn. So that moves somewhere in the middle, and it's more stable than the plain, but not as stable as the quarter. So quarter sawn wood is nice for drawer sides or applications where you need to know it's going to stay flat, like styles of a door or something like that. You're thinking about it. And sometimes it's just for the visual effect of the linear pattern on the wood. Wood is moving the most across the lines, but it hardly moves at all along the length. Okay, so the fibers are running in the length of this tree. Like, here's that piece of pine again. It moves some this way, but virtually not at all. It's negligible along the length. So this is why we have to think about the way we join pieces together. You can't always join something at where the grain is running this way and then running this way. And I'm going to show you why right now. So here's a couple pieces of veneer. One is maple and one is ash. These were cut exactly the same size. So they're square, and they're exactly the same width as this. So that's it's a little over 12.5 inches. So if I butt this up, I'm just going to hit it up against that stop, and then if I bring this up, it comes right to the edge there. See, right there. And it's the same the other way. So I'll put it in, it's right to the edge. I cut it that way, and I did the walnut one the exact same way. So these panels, these are exactly the same size. So in order to speed it up, I'm using veneer, but if this was regular wood and it got wet, it would start taking on moisture. So this is representing almost when the tree is cut down. But it takes, it's like, because it's a fibrous material, it takes a few minutes to do anything. So I'm going to set this aside. And then I'll do the same to the ash. That was walnut. And here's the ash. So now, This is across the tree, and this is the long grain here. So I'm expecting it to hardly move at all in this direction. It's a dead square. But to move, almost all of the movement will be across, almost like it's an accordion. So I'm always thinking, here's the grain, and here's across the grain. Okay? All right, I'll set that aside too. So here I've got an assortment of woods. They're all hardwoods except for the pine on the end. And if you've been woodworking a while, you could probably guess most of these. Over here we've got a couple different oaks. This one I just showed you, it's a cream colored wood with a grain that's very straight, looks like oak. This is ash. This one that's kind of purple looking now will turn a beautiful warm brown, and that's walnut. This one's gotten quite expensive lately, but it's kind of pink, brownish. This is South American mahogany, which is hard to come by these days. Most everything you find is African, but they also call it genuine mahogany. This one is cherry, just pink. And down the end we have a couple of maples and basswood. But I want to show you this. What I want to do is look into the cell structure. One of the things that's really interesting about wood, I think, is that every type of wood has its individual fingerprint. So any kind of wood can be identified by looking at the unique fingerprint of it. And it's in the end grain. So it's by looking at the cell structure on the end grain. So the way people really analyze it, of course, you look at the color. If you could see the leaves, you'd probably know, or the bark. But when you don't have that, and you just have the wood, you'd look at the end grain. So what I did was I made a cut of all of these pieces with the end grain up, and I hand planed it with a nice, well-tuned plane, so it's like a polished surface. That's the way you'll get like an uninhibited read onto the cell structure. So I've got this little microscope thingy. Anyway, I hand plane this to show the different cell structures. We're just getting the computer back on for that. While Chris is getting that set, I'm going to show you that wood movement thing. Let's see what happened, if anything. All right, so we've got the piece of walnut is square. First we'll check this length. Let's see if anything happened yet. I'm going to set it right up against. And I can just barely see that edge of walnut. So it grew over the 12 inches. It grew maybe a 64th, 12 and a half inches. But that was really wetting it. Now I'm going to turn it to the side this way. And now this is going across the grain. And I'm going to set the spacer the same. And look at that. It grew, let me measure this. Across the grain, it expanded just about 1/4 of an inch. So almost 1/4 inch. Now I know if I let it sit longer, it may even go more. But that shows you why, like in the summer, when you have all that humidity in the air, the wood is soaking it in and it's expanding. So the doors fit tighter. And then at this time in the winter, everything draws up so close. That's it right there. And it goes to like, in our homes in the winter, it's like 30, it gets down to 20 to 30 relative humidity in your house. So that's like, the wood just gets really dry. It goes down to 4 to 6% moisture content sometimes. So it's really shrinking. Sometimes you'll see doors crack and things like that, especially if you run a wood stove like we do. So let me shoot the ash piece. We'll check that one on the length. Up against the stop. And about the same thing. I can just barely see it, but I'm going to turn it this way. Right up against the stop. We'll check it. Wow, that grew even more. So the ash is 5/16 larger. So that is showing you that wood is growing quite a lot across the grain, but virtually none along the grain. And that's really a huge factor in woodworking. The wood moves, so you've got to make accommodations for it to move. Now, there are materials made, like plywood, that's extremely dimensionally stable in both directions because every other layer is just oriented the opposite way. And they're thin, and they're all glued in a press, and they resist each other. So the whole board ends up staying relatively flat and extremely stable dimensionally in both directions. So there are places for plywood in construction, but if you're working with solid wood, as we mostly are in furniture making, you got to really be tuned into that. We've got our microscope ready again, and I'm going to bring it over. Can you see that on the camera? Okay, so that is the end grain of white pine. So you can see the growth rings. You can see the lighter color. That's the early growth, and then as it darkens, that's the harder. But it's hard. It's not much difference, and there's virtually no tubes there. There's no cells or vessels coming at you like straws. Now we're going to move to the hardwood, and this next one is red oak, and look at that. So when the tubes are in a line like that, and it's very definable, like the line. So those tubes are the early growth, and then as it goes and it gets darker right before the next line of tubes, that's the late growth or the winter growth when it shuts down, and that gets harder. So those, when you have a real open pore like that, they call it open-grained wood. So if it's highly porous, it's an open-grained wood. And when they're all in a line like that, very defined line, like oak is, they're called ring porous. I mean, you know how they come through on the surface of an oak board. And when you finish an oak board, you have to think about how the finish might get captured in the pores and accentuate. So you use certain finishes on oak that you wouldn't use on a closed pore wood like hard maple. So that's a classic open pore wood. And then those white lines running perpendicular to the pores rings, those are medullary rays. And that's where you get that flecking that's interesting on oaks. But it's most interesting on white oak. It's most pronounced. And I'm going to show you that next. Here we go. Here's a white oak. So this is a slower growth, but you can see the pore structure. But you notice those pores are not as clean looking. They're not as open. There's actually, the pore structure of white oak is clogged up. It has stuff all in it. I mean, it still transports water, but this is what makes white oak a great wood against water. Like it's a good outdoor wood because it weathers very well, where red oak rots quickly because water gets all up through those open straws of pores, where the white oak, they're clogged. And look at how defined those white lines are running perpendicular. Those are the medullary rays which run radially from the center out. So this blows my mind. Every year, a new ring is added to the outside. But the medullary rays continue to grow and reattach and grow outward from the center. And they stay perfectly aligned. So you get this very cool figure on the surface. I'll show you in a minute, and we'll end with that. The next one is this creamy colored wood, and this is ash. I know if I asked you, is this an open grain or closed grain wood? You would say, well, it's open, of course. I see the cell structure. So, and this is, ash is very similar to the oaks in a way because it's ring porous. They're in a defined line, and it's open pored, but you don't have the medullary rays. as strong. You do see these very light ones between, but not as pronounced. Don't really notice them on the surface. Now we're going to a darker colored wood. This is walnut. So check that out. So different. Now, you can see the pores of the little specks there. Can you see them okay on the screen? And those little pores, notice how small they are. But still, because there are open pores, walnut is considered an open-grained wood. But this is the first wood we're looking at where they're not in a straight line. They're kind of evenly dispersed across the growth rings. That's called diffuse porous. So it's nice and even. You don't have a very obvious pattern of pores breaking through the surface on walnut. It's a smaller open-grained wood, so if you want a super smooth surface, you often have to fill the grain of walnut as well. Now I'm going to move to this is genuine mahogany. Has a really nice texture, but again, it's an open-grained wood. And is it ring porous or diffuse porous? That's clearly a diffuse. But the diffuse porous like that and the texture of mahogany makes it a beautiful carving wood. And that's why they used it so much in the 18th century to carve amazing ball and claw and leaf and shells. It's a wonderful carving wood because of the even texture. And it has small pores, which you can opt to fill or not, depending on where it is on the piece. But it's got an even texture. What I mean by that is there's not like a defined hardness delineation between the early and the late growth as you go from the softwood to the later growth. It's pretty much even hardness as you move across there. Now I'm going to show you the next one. And look at, can you see the pores in that? Really not. I mean, they're barely noticeable. They're very, very tiny. So this is our first closed grain wood. This is our first example of closed grain, and this is cherry. And again, the texture is very even across the growth rings. There's not like this hard line that some woods have between the different seasons of growth. The next one is another common one in this area. The one they're tapping right now for maple syrup. This is hard maple, sugar maple. And again, you don't see a huge delineation between the early and late growth. It's hard right on through. You can barely see the pores. They're super tiny. So maple is a hard, closed grain wood. So if you tried to finish this with a finish that would really highlight the pores on oak, it wouldn't do much on maple because the pigment or the powdery surface that gets captured in the open pores on oak just wipes right off of maple because there's no pores to grab it. But that's a whole nother discussion for finishing. And then the second to last one here, I'm going to turn my thing. This is one you don't see used a lot in furniture making, but carvers love it. And this is a white wood. Look how that is a super even textured wood right on through. And it's softer but firm, sort of like the mahogany. But it has a closed pore structure, not as open as the mahogany. This is basswood. This is preferred by caricature carvers and carvers who are doing like intense detail. They love this stuff. Now the next one and the last one, this is actually soft maple, very similar. And it's actually, you see a little delineation between the lines, but it's pretty even textured across them. But this one, this is actually curly maple. You don't see any curl on the end grain, but you do see it on the side. Curly maple is just a kind of figure of soft maple. It's not any, it's not a unique wood. It's just a definition of the figure. For some reason, some soft maple trees develop the curl and some don't. The curl is just a waviness in the growth structure. All right, so that's a good introduction, I think, to the cell structure of the wood, and it explains some. And just to highlight a couple of them, the white oak, these are those, remember those really strong white medullary ray lines? This is how it appears on the surface. This is the quarter sawn figure. So when you're cutting right across the grain, right perpendicular to the grain, as you saw in the picture, you get these surface medullary rays. And then on the plain sawn, you don't see them. And then this one, the grain is starting to run into the rift. So the medullary rays turn linear and they just about disappear. And this was what was so sought after in the craftsman period. They didn't like to see them like this. They were usually going for the rift sawn there. And then I showed you last the curly maple. I don't know if you can pick it up on this. But there's some nice curl there. Some good tear out there, too. This is that curly maple. So there's so much more we could have talked about. Hardness we didn't even get into. Weight. We talked a little bit about moisture. Its reaction to the water and the elements. Like mahogany is good and white oak does well. But there's such an amazing variety of wood. And then even within the species, there's such a variety of a really dense tree or a straight tree or highly figured, and it just never ends. So the material is never the same, even though you're working with similar material all the time. So the opportunities to use it and configure it in a decorative way are always there. So as we go along in these things, we'll be referring to these terms that we talked about today, but it's so important to just really understand your material. If you're a potter, you'd really need to know what it feels like to work the clay. And if you're working in metal, you've got to know all the characteristics of steel, which I know very little about. So, but with wood, it's a funny material. It's a great material, and it's so warm, and it can be so strong and meaningful, especially when it's tied to something close to you. All right, well, thank you so much for being a part of this. I'm really excited to go on, and we're going to just ramp it up and do more in the way of projects. I'm going to show you around the shop. I'm going to show you different machines, how they work, and I may even show you into my embarrassing places in the shop where I need to do some organization. I look forward to seeing you next time on Shop Night Live.